School is not a charity. Who gave you permission to feed him? The principal screamed when she spotted the lunchbox on the bench. The janitor hung his head, clutching the unopened meal box as security escorted him off campus. Students watched in confusion, seeing only an empty bench that afternoon. 3 days later, the parking lot filled with Marines in uniform. Who were they here for? And why would an entire platoon salute a fire janitor? Welcome to QH. Let's uncover what really happened. Leonard Briggs, 67, was a retired veteran who had served in logistics in Iraq. After being discharged, he lived alone and worked as a janitor at Anderson Creek Elementary School in suburban Tennessee. His small apartment, decorated with modest military memorabilia and faded photographs, sat just 3 blocks from the school, close enough to walk each morning, rain or shine. The students adored Leonard. He often shared stories from his military days and always kept candies in his pocket to secretly gift to children who seemed sad. His custodian's cart became known as the treasure trolley, with its hidden compartment of peppermints and butterscotch for tearful kindergartners or 4th graders struggling with math. Mr. Leonard makes the floor shine, but he makes sad faces shine brighter, one 2nd grader had written in a class assignment about community helpers. One day in early September, Leonard noticed Tobias, a 10-year-old boy, sitting alone after lunch. The child didn't have a lunchbox and only drank water, his shoulders hunched forward, eyes fixed on the ground as other children played nearby with full bellies and boundless energy. When Leonard gently asked, Tobias looked down and whispered, "My mom was busy today. She probably forgot to pack something." Leonard recognized the look, pride masking hunger. He'd seen it before, in places far from this peaceful school campus. Without another word he nodded and continued sweeping, but his mind was already forming a plan. The next day Leonard packed extra food, nothing fancy, just a turkey sandwich with cheese, an apple, and a small carton of milk. During lunch period he casually left half of his own lunch on the stone bench near the trash cans, where the boy usually sat. From that day on, leaving a paper lunch bag became a daily ritual. Each time, Leonard would silently place it down without saying a word, careful to disappear before Tobias arrived. The boy never mentioned it, but his brightening eyes and improving energy told Leonard everything he needed to know. For 3 weeks, this quiet exchange continued without incident. Leonard began preparing special meals, adding little notes with jokes or interesting facts about places he'd seen during his service. "Did you know that in the desert, sand can sing?" One note read, "When the grains rub together just right, they make music only those who listen closely can hear." But one Friday in late September, disaster struck. Principal Monroe, known for her strict policies and clipboard-wielding efficiency, stepped out of her office just as Tobias was opening the lunchbox. She stormed over, face reddening beneath her perfectly styled blonde bob. "Who gave you this? Who authorized anyone to distribute food to students?" Her voice carried across the playground, drawing stares from teachers on yard duty. The schoolyard fell silent, children froze in mid-play, turning to watch the unfolding scene. Leonard, who had been emptying a trash bin nearby, stepped forward, speaking softly. I just didn't want the boy to go hungry. School is not a charity. Who gave you permission to feed him?" She screamed, "This violates health codes and school policy. What if he had allergy? What if his parents sued?" The janitor hung his head, clutching the unopened meal box as 2 security guards approached, summoned by a teacher's hasty phone call. Students watched in stunned silence as the kind man who'd fixed their paper, jammed toilets and found lost toys was escorted from the premises. But he was just being nice. One small voice piped up, quickly silenced by a teacher's warning glance. That very afternoon, Leonard received termination papers for violation of food safety protocols, unauthorized interaction with students, and insubordination. The official letterhead made the simple act of kindness seem like a criminal offense. As Leonard packed his small locker, he didn't argue or plead. Instead, he simply nodded. "I understand, but I'd do it again." "This is completely inappropriate," Mrs. Monroe insisted as she watched him leave. "We have proper channels for these things. You can't just feed children without authorization." Leonard only smiled sadly. "Ma'am, in my experience, hunger doesn't wait for paperwork." With that, the old veteran walked through the front gates, not looking back at the school that had been his workplace for the past 8 years. The afternoon sun caught his silver hair as he squared his shoulders, the military bearing never quite leaving him, even in defeat. What nobody realized was that one small pair of eyes watched the entire scene unfold from behind the classroom window, and those eyes belonged to someone with connections that would soon rock the entire community. If you've ever witnessed someone being fired just for doing what was right, stay with us. Tobias disappeared for 3 days after the incident. He didn't come to class. His homeroom teacher simply stated, sick leave, but offered no details when students asked about their classmates' absence. The bench where Tobias usually sat remained vacant, an unintentional monument to the kindness that had cost Leonard his job. At home, in a small apartment decorated with military photographs and medals, Tobias sat at the kitchen table. His mother worked the night shift at the hospital and slept during the day, leaving him alone with his thoughts. The fridge contained just enough for the week, carefully budgeted, with every dollar stretched to its limit. With a pencil and lined paper, Tobias wrote a letter to his uncle, Captain Mitchell Crane, currently serving with the Marines stationed in North Carolina. The boy's handwriting was careful, determined, each word chosen with purpose despite occasional spelling mistakes. The letter was brief: Uncle Ron, I'm okay. But the only nice person I know got fired for helping me eat. The principal yelled really loud. I was scared. I think Dad would be sad if he knew. Tobias folded the paper precisely, corners matching with military precision, something his father had taught him before deployment. He placed it in an envelope, using his allowance for the stamp, and walked to the mailbox alone. The letter reached Captain Crane 2 days later, arriving amid requisition forms and operational briefs. After reading it, he said nothing, simply handing it to his commanding officer, a stern-faced colonel with 30 years of service etched into the lines around his eye. Sir, this concerns my brother's son, was all Crane said. The colonel read it twice, then looked up, understanding immediately. What the school didn't know, what Leonard himself hadn't known, was that Tobias's father, Staff Sergeant Michael Crane, had been killed in action 3 years ago while saving civilians in a combat zone. His transport had been hit by an IED, and despite catastrophic injuries, he'd managed to get 3 Iraqi children to safety before succumbing to his wounds. For his actions, he'd received the Silver Star posthumously. The medal sat in Tobias's bedroom drawer, too painful for his mother to display, but too precious to put away. Since then, Tobias's mother had been working 2 jobs, hospital receptionist by night and delivery driver by day, sometimes forgetting lunch in the morning rush between shifts. Pride had kept her from applying for the free lunch program, the same pride that had kept Tobias quiet about his hunger. My father was a hero, he'd once told a classmate who noticed his empty lunch spot. Heroes don't complain. The next morning, an entire unit was summoned, not for military duty, but for what their commander called a matter of protecting honor. The briefing was short, the mission unusual, but clear: recognize a civilian who had embodied the core values of the Corps without even knowing it. They drove 3 dust-covered black SUVs across state lines, carrying gift boxes, a triangular folded flag and a framed uniform. Word spread through military channels, and by the time they crossed the Georgia-Tennessee line, their convoy had grown to include veterans from 3 different bases, all converging on a small elementary school in suburban Tennessee. Captain Crane explained to his men during the drive. The man who was fired, Leonard Briggs, served in the 7th Logistics Battalion in Iraq. He wasn't just any veteran, he was among those who ensured my brother's body made it home with dignity. He passed around a photograph. Leonard, much younger but recognizable, standing at attention beside a flag-draped transfer case. And now he's lost his livelihood for feeding my brother's son. The news rippled through the convoy. A sergeant in the back seat removed his cap, running weathered fingers around its edge. Sir, does the school know who they fired? No, Crane replied, staring at the highway stretching before them. Leonard never speaks about his service. He never told anyone he was part of the team that handled fallen soldiers with such care. He never mentioned that he personally ensured every family received their loved ones with honor, staying up all night to press uniforms and polish buttons. Another Marine added, my cousin's kid goes to that school, says the old janitor, just tells funny stories about desert sand and never talks about the hard parts, never mentions the men he helped bring home. The silence that followed was filled with understanding. For veterans, there was no higher calling than honoring the fallen and no greater disgrace than disrespecting those who upheld that sacred duty. As they crossed into Tennessee, Captain Crane received a call. Their mission had gained momentum. What started as one unit's response had spread through veteran networks, through social media channels used by military families, through the invisible brotherhood that connected those who served. By morning, they expected Marines from 3 different bases to converge on the small elementary school. It's not just about the boy anymore, his commanding officer said over the phone. It's about what Harris represents. Dignity doesn't end with discharge paper. Meanwhile, Leonard sat in his small apartment, looking through old photographs. One showed him in desert fatigues, standing beside a transport plane. Another captured a solemn moment, his gloved hands adjusting a flag over a fallen soldier. He wasn't angry about losing his job, just worried about Tobias. His fingers lingered on a photograph of a unit gathering. In the background, barely visible, stood a young sergeant, Tobias's father. Though Leonard had never made the connection, he picked up his phone and dialed a local community service number. "Hello, I'd like to report a child who might need food assistance," he began, not knowing that miles away, a convoy of Marines was heading toward Anderson Creek Elementary with a very different solution in mind. Have you ever seen a child stand up for what's right, and what happens when that child has an army standing behind them? Monday morning, 3 military SUVs pulled into Anderson Creek Elementary's parking lot, followed by a procession of personal vehicles carrying Marines in full dress uniform. The early morning sunshine glinted off polished buttons and decorations, creating an imposing spectacle outside the ordinary brick school building. The sight stopped teachers and parents in their tracks. Morning drop-off froze as families remained in their cars watching the disciplined formation take shape. Vehicle doors opened, and Marines in impeccable uniforms stepped out one by one, forming precise lines on the asphalt. "What on earth?" muttered the gym teacher, coffee cups suspended halfway to his lips. One Marine held a sign that read, "We are here for Leonard Briggs, veteran, 67 years old." Principal Monroe had just arrived, her luxury sedan pulling into her reserve parking space. As she stepped out, briefcase in hand, her face drained of color upon seeing the military assembly, she approached cautiously, heels clicking against the pavement as she navigated between parked cars. He doesn't work here anymore," she stammered, clutching her leather portfolio like a shield. A lieutenant with ribbons across his chest looked her directly in the eyes and stated firmly, "We know, but honor isn't on a payroll, it resides in gratitude." The unit marched on to school grounds, moving with synchronized precision that immediately commanded respect. Parents began parking haphazardly, abandoning morning routines to follow this unexpected development. The Marines raised an American flag in the central courtyard, the fabric unfurling against the blue Tennessee sky. Students pressed their faces against classroom windows, watching in awe as the uniformed men and women formed perfect lines. Teachers abandoned morning preparations, gathering in doorways and hallways, whispering questions no one could answer. Captain Crane stepped forward with a microphone that had been connected to the school's PA system, his voice resonating through indoor speakers and outdoor bullhorns. "Students of Anderson Creek Elementary, my name is Captain Mitchell Crane, United States U.S. Marine. 3 days ago, a man who served this country with distinction was removed from this school for an act of kindness. That man, Leonard Briggs, didn't just feed a hungry child, he fed my nephew, the son of a fallen Marine." Gasps spread through the gathering crowd. Principal Monroe stepped back, her hand flying to her throat, suddenly understanding the magnitude of her decision. "Mr. Harris never told you who he was," Captain Crane continued, his voice controlled but vibrating with emotion. "He never mentioned that in Iraq he was responsible for ensuring that fallen soldiers returned home with dignity. He never told you that he personally prepared my brother's uniform before his funeral. He never boasted that he stayed with my brother's body for 2 straight days to ensure he was never alone on his final journey home." By now parents had begun arriving in greater numbers, drawn by calls and texts about the military presence. Local news vans pulled up at the curb, reporters recognizing the potential significance of Marines appearing at an elementary school on an ordinary Monday. The child he helped is the son of Staff Sergeant Michael Crane, who gave his life protecting a civilian convoy from enemy fire. "And the man you fired was the same man who made sure my brother came home to his family with honor." The captain's voice broke slightly on the last word. Behind him, Marines stood at unwavering attention, eyes forward, embodying the discipline and respect that defined their service. Staff Sergeant Crane received his actions that day. He saved 3 children before he died, and last week, Leonard Briggs, without knowing any connection, continued that legacy of protection by making sure my brother's son didn't go hungry. The captain turned to Principal Monroe, who now stood rigid under the collective gaze of parents, staff and Marines. "Ma'am, in the Marines we have a saying, no one left behind." Mr. Harris lived by that code even after leaving service. When he saw a child of a fallen brother going hungry, he didn't file paperwork, he didn't form a committee, he didn't wait for permission, he acted. The principal's usual composure had crumbled, her mouth opened and closed without sound, the practiced administrative responses failing her in this unprecedented moment. We didn't know," she finally managed. "The policy is clear about outside food." "With all due respect, ma'am," interrupted a gunnery sergeant stepping forward. "Sometimes humanity outranks policy." The assembled Marines nodded in silent agreement. Afterward, the Marines drove to Leonard's small apartment complex. Neighbors peered from windows and balconies as the procession of vehicles parked along the street. When Leonard opened his door, dressed in simple khakis and a faded button-up shirt, He was stunned to see soldiers standing at attention, saluting him. "What is all this?" he asked, his voice barely audible. "Mr. Harris, you don't know what you've done," said the lieutenant, "but to us, you represent silent honor, the kind that acts without recognition or reward." They presented him with a letter of appreciation from the Defense Department, signed by the Secretary himself, a community honor medal, specially commissioned for those who serve beyond uniform, a new job offer, ethics instructor for the local youth military program with full benefits and housing allowance. What happened next surprised everyone. News crews arrived, capturing the moment when dozens of uniformed Marines escorted Leonard back to Anderson Creek Elementary. The convoy grew as they drove, veterans from the community joining spontaneously, American flags fluttering from car windows. As they walked through the front gate, students lined the walkway, holding handmade signs, "Thank you, Mr. Leonard," and "Heroes feed heroes." Teachers stood behind them, some wiping away tears as the procession passed. The morning's impromptu assembly had evolved into something more significant, a lesson in honor and consequences that no textbook could provide. Principal Monroe stood at the entrance, visibly uncomfortable as Captain Crane approached with Leonard. Her tailored suit and perfect hair contrasted sharply with Leonard's simple dignity and the Marines' formal uniforms. "Miss Monroe," Leonard said gently, extending his hand, "I understand why you had to enforce the rules. Schools need order, but sometimes rules need exception." Instead of responding verbally, she handed him an envelope, his reinstatement papers, along with a formal apology from the school board, who had convened an emergency meeting after receiving dozens of calls from Marine headquarters. But Leonard didn't immediately accept. "Before I consider coming back," he said, "I'd like the school to implement a no-questions-asked food program, so no child ever has to explain why they're hungry." Captain Crane stepped forward. "The U.S. Marines will fund it. We'll call it the Crane-Harris program." "My brother would want that," his name alongside the man who honored his son. As cameras flashed and reporters gathered, Leonard noticed Tobias standing in the crowd, partially hidden behind his mother, who had taken the day off work after receiving a call about the gathering. The boy rushed forward, breaking from his mother's grip, and hugged the old janitor tightly. "You didn't tell me your dad was a hero," Leonard whispered, kneeling to meet the boy's eyes. Tobias looked up with tears streaming down his cheeks. "You didn't tell me you were one too. Have you ever seen someone who was cast aside, then honored by an entire platoon? Type honor if you believe justice always returns, sometimes wearing a uniform." Leonard declined interviews and refused financial support, keeping only the framed flag and badge that read, "The unit never forgets those who stood right when others turned away." Tobias returned to school. He brought a new lunchbox every day, provided by his uncle's unit, but maintained a habit that surprised his teachers, always sharing half his meal. When asked why, he simply replied, "Because that's what heroes do." The boy was now known by everyone, not because his uncle was a Marine or his father a fallen hero, but because he stood up for the janitor when no one else would. His simple letter had mobilized an entire military branch, and changed the culture of his school. In the schoolyard, the stone bench where Leonard used to leave food now bore a small plaque. "Here, someone once did right, not because he was told to, but because he couldn't look away." 6 months later, the Crane-Harris program had spread to 47 schools across the state. The premise was simple: food available with no questions asked, funded by veterans organizations and staffed by volunteers. Many of the volunteers were veterans themselves, finding new purpose in ensuring no child felt the hunger that had once been silently endured. Leonard did eventually accept the teaching position with the youth military program, but only for weekends. During weekdays he remained at Anderson Creek Elementary, where his presence served as a living reminder that compassion sometimes requires courage. Principal Monroe, forever changed by the experience, worked alongside Leonard to transform school policies. Together they created a system where rules serve people, not the other way around. Her office door, once intimidatingly closed, now remained open, with a sign reading "Solutions start here." One afternoon, as Leonard walked through the hallway, he noticed a first grader discreetly slipping a sandwich to a classmate. When their eyes met, the child froze, afraid of punishment. Instead, Leonard smiled and whispered, "Sometimes kindness is the most important rule." The children grinned back, continuing their quiet exchange. The story made national headlines, sparking conversations about how communities support military families, and how small acts of compassion can ripple outward. Legislators in 3 states drafted hunger-free campus bills, citing the Crane-Harris incident in their preambles. Captain Crane often visited, bringing Marines to speak with students about service beyond combat.
service to community, to principles, to each other. During one visit, he pulled Leonard aside. "My brother would be proud," he said quietly, "not just of what you did for his son, but for what you've started." Leonard patted the captain's shoulder. "We just reminded people that behind every uniform and every child, there's a story we might not know." On Veterans Day that year, Anderson Creek Elementary hosted a special ceremony. Students and Marines stood side by side as Leonard raised the flag. Tobias stood beside him, no longer the hungry boy on the bench, but a young man learning the power of standing up for others. As the flag reached full staff, Leonard saluted, not just as a former soldier, but as someone who had found a new mission, ensuring no child felt forgotten, and no act of kindness went unrecognized. That morning, as Leonard stood beside Tobias raising the flag, he wasn't thinking about medals or speeches. He was thinking about peanut butter sandwiches, unspoken hunger, and the quiet choices that shape the character of a nation. Every ripple started from one bag left on a bench, and now it echoed through classrooms, cafeterias, and hearts across the country. The ripples of that simple lunch bag continued to spread, proving that sometimes the most powerful force isn't authority or rules, but the quiet determination of those who refuse to look away when someone needs help. Have you ever seen someone fired for helping others, and then lifted up by a force nobody expected? Share a moment when you witness someone silent finally being heard by an entire community. Subscribe to QH Incredible Stories, where right actions are never forgotten.